How did the 15th Amendment influence African Americans' right to vote during the Jim Crow era from 1870 to 1930?
Jim Crow laws were created after the Civil War when slavery was abolished in 1865. They were formed to legalize and justify segregation, but their purposes ran deeper than that.
In addition, these laws made it impossible for African Americans to participate as equals with white citizens in many aspects of their daily lives. These laws were also made to restrict who had political power.
In other words, they were made to keep anyone who was not white away from being able to have a say on who leads the country.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
What we just read to you is the 15th Amendment that was passed in 1870. This amendment was supposed to open more opportunities for African Americans to vote. Keyword, supposed to.
The 15th Amendment didn't immediately influence African Americans' right to vote because states denied their legal responsibilities by using state-sponsored violence, allowing extrajudicial violence, and employing legal means in order to keep African Americans from voting.
State-sponsored violence is violence that the state initiates and supports. In this case, many states use the police force to keep African Americans from voting.
After the 15th Amendment was passed, African Americans didn't suddenly get the right to vote. Instead, they were faced with violent threats from the sheriff at polling places and wrongful imprisonments when on their way to vote.
The black incarceration rate was 3.1 times as high as the white incarceration rate during the Jim Crow era. One major reason being sheriff and local police would wrongfully arrest and assault African Americans to keep them from voting.
Those who tried to vote would face horrific consequences such as being lynched, receiving jail time, and getting beaten to death. These extreme punishments were used to instill a fear of even trying to vote, successfully reducing how many African Americans ended up at polling places.
This contradicts the notion that the police force and the state carried out their responsibility to enforce the law of citizens not being denied the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
Further proving that the 15th Amendment did not immediately impact African Americans' right to vote during this time.
Extrajudicial violence is violence of a person or certain group of people without the lawful authority granted by judicial proceedings. This type of violence usually appeared in very extreme ways.
For example, a very extreme case of extrajudicial violence was the Ku Klux Klan, but less organized groups still partook in these awful endeavors.
According to a video from the site Reconstruction in America, by 1875, 5 years after the 15th Amendment had passed, there was a total number of 1,853 recorded racial terror lynchings.
Most of these were performed by white mobs. And what did the government do about these actions? Nothing.
However, lynchings weren't the only awful thing these groups would take part in.
An article by Brooker Russell states that blacks who tried to vote were threatened, beaten, and killed. This source then further explains that crazy white rioters would burn down homes, cause people to lose their jobs, and endanger their families.
Specifically, the Ku Klux Klan had numerous violent ways of intimidating black voters. For instance, they would parade on horseback in strange costumes at night, publicly whip black women who didn't show the Klansmen enough respect, and assassinate major political leaders.
Though this violence was not the state's doing, they still allowed it to happen, which was neglecting their responsibility to keep their citizens safe.
There were several ways the government employed legal means to keep African Americans from voting. Most of these were essentially loopholes they had found in the 15th Amendment.
Some examples of this included literacy tests, poll taxes, the grandfather clause, property tests, all white primary elections, and even purges.
These new laws' sole purpose was to keep African Americans from voting. They were created with the idea of being rigged against them.
Literacy tests were created to eliminate uneducated voters. However, these tests were nearly impossible to pass even for educated white people.
The questions on the test were written in such a confusing manner that no one could understand them. One problem told the test taker to write every other word in this first line and print every third word in the same line, but capitalize the fifth word that you write.
But this didn't matter, considering the fact that the white officials who oversaw these tests would let these educated white voters pass on the basis of having good morals.
Even if an African American miraculously passed the literacy test, they wouldn't be allowed to vote in the Democratic election, which was the only one that mattered because the candidate that won the Democratic election almost always won the overall election.
The grandfather clause stated that even if you couldn't read and own no property, you could still vote if your father or grandfather had voted before 1867.
This rule would only work for whites because no black citizens had ever voted before 1867. The government knew this and still passed this law knowing that it would eliminate the majority of black voters.
Another law that did the same thing was poll taxes. Poll taxes were generally too much for poor whites and African Americans whose salaries were significantly lower than the average white person.
The list goes on with laws states enforced after the 15th Amendment was implemented.
The reason they formed these laws was to uphold white supremacy and have white citizens be the only ones with any say.
The many states that enforced these laws denied their responsibility to obey the laws that Congress had made.
The 15th Amendment was passed with the idea of reintegrating African Americans into society after the abolition of slavery at the end of the Civil War.
Given the information we just presented, do you think the 15th Amendment's intention was effective? I sure don't. At least not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed.
Although the Jim Crow era was a long time ago, we still see many examples of discrimination today.
We have learned so much from the Jim Crow era, which is important because, as said by British Prime Minister and writer Winston Churchill, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
We have both loved learning about this period in history, and we hope you enjoyed our documentary.
Thank you!